Dawn rose over the Gazala line like a torch behind gauze, soft at first and then pitiless. The desert glittered cold under the first sunlight, a land of stones, sand, and silence broken only by the rattle of engines coughing to life. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Rosner, reconnaissance officer of the 15th Panzer Division, spat dust from his mouth and cursed the desert again. His armoured car, a slender SD, KFZ 222, idled unevenly beside him. Somewhere to the south, the Afrika Korps was preparing another probing attack against the British. But this morning, something else caught Rosner's eye, something absurd. Across the shallow wadi, a small vehicle bounced through the sand, heading toward a British outpost. It looked like a child's toy that had lost its way from a nursery. A tiny, open-topped box on 4 thick wheels, a square hood, and a flimsy canvas roof flapping against the wind. It was no Kübelwagen, no Mercedes command car, not even one of the Italians' fragile Fiats. It was a foreign thing, ugly, utilitarian, and altogether unmilitary. The British soldiers sitting inside laughed as they drove, the little machine skittering over rocks where Rosner's heavy car would have bogged down. He lifted his Zeiss binoculars, squinting through the shimmer of heat. Kinderspielzeug, he muttered, a child's toy. His driver, Feldwebel Koch, smirked. A milk cart with wheels. The men around him laughed, but uneasily. The toy was climbing a slope of gravel that the SD crew had avoided for weeks. Its tires clawed forward, spitting dust, never faltering. Within moments, it reached the crest and disappeared toward the British lines. "What in God's name is that?" Koch asked. Rosner lowered the glasses. "An American contraption, perhaps. It looks too crude for British engineering." He was right. The small machine was an American-built quarter-ton 4x4 truck, a Willys MB, though no one in the Afrika Korps yet knew that name. To them, it was simply the Englischer Spähwagen, an English scout car. Later they would learn the word the Allies used, jeep. At first sight, it was easy to mock. It had no curves, no polish, no aura of German precision. The Kübelwagen, built by Volkswagen, was the proper military motorcar, light, air-cooled, and efficient. It drove like a well-behaved beetle, reliable on hard ground. But it had only 2 driven wheels. On the desert's loose crust, it skated and sank, its narrow tires sliced instead of floating. The Jeep, by contrast, seemed born of sand and stubbornness. 2 days later, Rosner encountered one up close. After an engagement near Bir Hakeim, his patrol stumbled upon a wrecked British supply column. Among the burned trucks and riddled tankers stood a small vehicle with its hood open, radiator steaming like a kettle. It had taken a bullet through the engine block. The British driver lay dead beside it, his hands still clutching the steering wheel. The men gathered around the machine. It was ugly. Square panels riveted without grace. The seats were mere frames with canvas stretched over them. The instruments, speedometer, oil gauge, fuel dial were crude. But everything about it screamed practicality. Tools mounted on the body, a shovel bolted to the side, a spare wheel on the back, a can for water, another for fuel. The steering column sat high, the pedals simple, the gearbox heavy. 4 forward gears, 1 reverse, a lever marked 4WD. Koch tugged it experimentally, and the mechanism clicked into place with a solid, confident sound. 2 driven axles, he said, surprised. That's madness in a car this small. Or genius, Rosner replied. They towed the wreck back to camp, curiosity defeating pride. The division mechanics examined it like priests deciphering scripture. Within hours, one conclusion spread through the motor pool. The machine could go anywhere. Its suspension, soft and independent, let the wheels stay on the ground while others lifted. Its engine, a Willys Go Devil, 60 horsepower from 4 cylinders, looked laughably small, yet it pulled like a mule. With all 4 wheels engaged, the Jeep crawled over dunes, trenches, and rocks that stopped trucks twice its size. When Rommel himself visited the forward units the next week, one of these captured jeeps was demonstrated for him. The general's reaction became legend. The driver started the engine with a metallic cough, engaged low gear, and drove straight over a ridge where a Kübelwagen had bogged down minutes earlier. Rommel's staff officers laughed, until the jeep turned in a tight circle and came back up another slope without slowing. The field marshal nodded once. "We could use a few thousand of these," he said dryly. By January of 1942, the mockery had faded. Afrika Korps reports began referring to captured jeeps as Beutewagen booty vehicles with specific maintenance instructions attached. Mechanics stripped the Ford and Willys markings, painted crosses on the sides, and issued them to reconnaissance units. They valued the jeep's ability to climb escarpments and carry radio equipment. Some were fitted with MG-34 machine guns, others with stretchers for field evacuation. In photographs from the desert, Rommel himself is seen standing in the back of a captured jeep, goggles around his neck, wind whipping his scarf. Rösner's platoon eventually received one, painted field grey with a white cross on the hood. He called it Der kleine Esel, the little donkey. It could turn in half the space of a Kübelwagen and reach forward observation posts in minutes instead of hours. When fuel convoys bogged down in soft sand, it ferried messages. When radios failed, it carried runners. When aircraft strafed, it darted off the road and hid behind dunes. It became the most reliable member of the unit. At night, as Rösner wrote in his field diary, he marveled that such a thing could exist. "The Americans," he wrote, "build as they think, simply, but with purpose. We perfect things until they break. They make things that cannot break." The jeep began to symbolize something larger than its steel. It represented a philosophy foreign to the German mind that strength lay not in complexity, but in abundance and simplicity. For every German vehicle crafted like a watch, the Americans built 10 jeeps like hammers. They required no officer's permission to start, no engineer's adjustment to repair. A corporal with a wrench could keep it running. That, Rösner realized, was the true threat. By the time the British counterattacked at El Alamein in late 1942, jeeps swarmed the desert like insects. Reconnaissance, ambulance, command post, gun platform, one vehicle for every need. The Afrika Korps captured more, coveted more, and lost more. Mechanics cannibalized wrecks for parts. Officers requisitioned them unofficially. Men fought over them like treasure. And every time one roared past, some soldier muttered the same words in disbelief. Kinderspielzeug, and it conquered the desert. Germany had laughed. But in the laughter's echo came respect, then envy, then dependence. The jeep was no longer a vehicle. It was mobility incarnate, a weapon shaped like freedom, rolling endlessly across the sand. By the winter of 1941, the Germans had learned to respect the little American machine. By the spring of 1942, they began to fear what it represented. To understand the jeep was to understand American industry itself, a civilization that thought in millions, not in hundreds. The story of its creation was as astonishing as its performance on the battlefield. In the summer of 1940, while Europe burned, the United States Army issued a desperate request to the nation's automobile companies. They wanted a light reconnaissance vehicle that could carry 4 men and a machine gun, climb a 60% grade, ford 2 feet of water, and weigh no more than 2,200 pounds. And they wanted the first working prototype in 49 days. In Germany, that kind of requirement would have been a punchline. Engineers would have written committees, drawn endless blueprints, and demanded a year of testing. In America, they simply built it. The tiny American Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania, answered the challenge. With fewer than 20 engineers, they designed, assembled, and tested a prototype in 6 weeks. The car, squat and square, performed so well that the army ordered thousands, but Bantam was too small to build them. So the government handed the blueprints to 2 larger manufacturers, Willys Overland and Ford Motor Company. For German officers studying captured examples later, this was an ideological revelation. In the Reich, such an act giving designs to rival companies would have been treason. In America, it was efficiency. Every bolt, every panel, every tool mark was standardized. Willys called its version the MB, Ford built the GPW. Together, they produced more than 600,000 Jeeps before the war's end, a staggering number that dwarfed German output of all light vehicles combined. Even the famous Kübelwagen, Germany's desert workhorse, barely reached 50,000 units. The mathematics of defeat were already being written in steel and rivets. American simplicity was not primitive. It was precision of another kind, precision of purpose. The Jeep's four-cylinder Go Devil engine produced only 60 horsepower, yet it could haul half a ton up a mountain track. Its transmission used ordinary gears, not delicate planetary systems. Its wiring could be repaired with pliers. Every part was interchangeable between factories. A wheel from a Ford Jeep fit perfectly on a Willys. The army could strip a wreck, ship the components halfway around the world, and rebuild another Jeep within hours. To German engineers trained in the art of refinement, this was barbarism. To American soldiers, it was salvation. By the spring of 1942, German intelligence officers had begun collecting technical reports on captured Jeeps. One of these documents, later found in the archives of the U.S. Army after the war, is blunt. The English-American light vehicle shows no sophistication in design. It is crude, yet it endures. It can be repaired by any man with hands. Such simplicity suggests dangerous efficiency in manufacture. Dangerous efficiency. That phrase haunted the German command. While they designed machines that required skilled mechanics and special tools, the Americans had built a vehicle that any farm boy could maintain. Each Jeep came with a toolkit, wrenches, pliers, jack, grease gun, tire pump packed neatly under the seat. Its engine was so accessible that a soldier could remove it in 30 minutes. In field depots, entire powertrains were swapped like batteries. More frightening still was the rhythm of American production. At Willys in Toledo, Ohio, and at Ford's massive River Rouge plant in Michigan, the assembly lines ran day and night. One Jeep rolled off the line every 80 seconds. To German officers who measured time in man-hours per vehicle, this was sorcery. But it was simply the logic of the American factory specialization, automation, and a nation where machines built machines. When the first photographic intelligence reached Berlin, showing thousands of Jeeps lined up on docks in Norfolk and New York, awaiting shipment, disbelief spread through the officer corps. The Luftwaffe called them invasion gnats. The Navy called them land locusts. But the Wehrmacht staff officers, buried in fuel shortages and mechanical failures, saw something deeper. Each Jeep was a symbol of how the enemy fought its war decentralized, mobile, flexible. If one broke, another took its place. No delays, no waiting for spares, no worship of perfection. The Kübelwagen, by contrast, was elegant but fragile. Its air-cooled Volkswagen engine worked flawlessly on hard ground but overheated in the desert. It was light but narrow, efficient but slow. And when a part failed, replacement required factory-level skill. German mechanics, forced to improvise in the sand, often cannibalized 2 or 3 to keep one running. They admired its design, but they envied the Jeep's indifference to conditions. "It will run," wrote one Afrika Korps officer, "even if it hates you." As the war expanded across deserts, jungles, and frozen plains, the Jeep's numbers multiplied like a species adapted to every environment. In North Africa, it carried generals and privates alike. In Burma, it hauled supplies through mud that swallowed trucks. In Alaska, it started at 40 degrees below zero. And everywhere it went, the same reaction followed: laughter first, silence second, and imitation third. By late 1942, German factories received orders to study captured Jeeps for possible reproduction. They discovered what the Americans already knew. Simplicity was hard to copy. The tooling required to stamp the Jeep's thick steel panels, the forging of axles, the production of standardized bolts all depended on industrial scale. Germany no longer possessed under bombing and blockade. What began as mockery was now obsession. German intelligence tracked jeep shipments, counted crates, and even reported on their use by Soviet units on the Eastern Front. It was a machine so ordinary, it became extraordinary, a symbol of a nation that could afford to give perfection to the lowest rank. The jeep was no longer a curiosity. It was the mathematics of mobility itself, an equation of mass and purpose that Germany could not solve. By the spring of 1942, mockery had turned into admiration, and admiration soon turned into theft. Across the endless sands of North Africa, the Afrika Korps learned that the little American jeep was not merely a vehicle, it was a weapon that could go where German engineering stopped. The first captured jeeps were treated as curiosities. Mechanics studied them in the shade of palm groves, arguing over the crude gearbox and box-shaped chassis. But once the men began to drive them, fascination replaced ridicule. The quarter-ton 4x4 could move faster than motorcycles across rough sand, climb escarpments like a mule, and keep its footing where the two-wheel drive Kübelwagen spun helplessly. Its low gearing and four-driven wheels made the difference between progress and paralysis. In early May of 1942, an incident near Bir Hakeim changed everything. A reconnaissance patrol from the 33rd Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion was pinned by British machine gun fire. A captured jeep, driven by Feldwebel Ernst Keller, was used to pull wounded men from the kill zone under heavy fire. The vehicle bounced through shell craters and over soft dunes, its tiny engine screaming but never failing. When it returned, riddled with bullet holes yet still running, the men gathered around in disbelief. From that day forward, captured jeeps were no longer souvenirs, they were assets. Field orders soon reflected the new reality. Commanders began issuing specific directives to capture and preserve Allied jeeps. The quartermaster department at Afrika Korps headquarters even circulated maintenance notes titled Beautywagen English, Bedienung Chinese. The document recommended conserving American spark plugs, tires, and filters as valuable strategic materials. In practice, this meant that jeeps were treated better than many German vehicles. Some officers repainted them with the black Balkenkreuz. Others kept the original Allied markings to blend into the desert. Rommel himself was among the first to recognize their tactical potential. In one of the most famous photographs of the desert campaign, the field marshal stands in the back of a captured jeep, binoculars raised, his scarf snapping in the wind. The caption in his staff records reads simply, Auf Beautyfahrzeug bei Aufklärung. He had discovered that a small, light vehicle was far better suited for leading patrols than his cumbersome command car. The jeep could slip through wadis, crest dunes, and turn sharply without sinking. Reports from the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions soon echoed the same observation. A jeep could traverse terrain that defeated half-tracks. The British long-range desert group, already masters of deep reconnaissance, used jeeps to raid German fuel dumps hundreds of miles behind the front. Rommel's men began to imitate their tactics. They armed their captured jeeps with MG-34s mounted on pintles, fitted brackets for fuel cans, and loaded the rear with ammunition belts. What had been a symbol of Allied mobility became the favorite vehicle of German raiders. By midsummer, some units went so far as to exchange 2 Kübelwagens for a single captured jeep. The Kübelwagen's air-cooled engine and narrow tires were perfect for the highways of Europe but helpless in sand. When it bogged down, the men cursed it as Das Kindersarg, the child's coffin. The jeep, on the other hand, became the desert's miracle. It could carry radio equipment, ammunition, or wounded men, and it needed no road, no special treatment, only petrol and a willing driver. Rüsner, who had first mocked the toy car, now kept 2 jeeps in his reconnaissance platoon. He named them Lottie and Elsa after his sisters. He quickly learned that the jeep could serve as a command post, an ambulance, or even a mobile gun carriage. His men stripped a Breda machine gun from a damaged Italian truck and mounted it on the hood. "She kicks like a mule," his driver laughed, "but she fights like a tiger." The jeep also changed how the Fies, Germans, saw the enemy. Until then, they had believed the British and Americans were soft soldiers, dependent on machines. Yet these machines, tough, adaptable, and simple, were exactly what the desert demanded. The men began to ask uncomfortable questions. How could a democracy, which supposedly wasted its resources, produce such efficiency? How could the Americans, mocked as decadent, build a car that no German engineer could equal? As the months passed, German camps filled with jeeps in every condition, sand-blasted, bullet-scarred, patched with tin and canvas. Mechanics learned to make parts from scrap metal, using bolts scavenged from destroyed trucks. Fuel became precious, but whenever a jeep appeared, it was refueled first. Officers hoarded them like treasure, assigning them to reconnaissance patrols and command duties. One desert mechanic wrote in his diary, later recovered by Allied forces, "We have two kinds of vehicles now, the German ones that wait for help and the American ones that help themselves." When the tide of war turned after El Alamein and the Afrika Korps began its long retreat westward, jeeps led the convoys. They scouted routes, carried messages, and rescued stranded vehicles. They seemed unstoppable, even when their tires were bald and their engines gasped for oil. Rommel's last staff car to leave Tunisia was not a Mercedes, but a captured Willys, its sides dented and its paint faded. By then, the men no longer laughed. The jeep had become the desert's badge of survival, the single machine that every German soldier trusted more than his own equipment. In the ruins of the campaign, officers would later write in their reports that the jeep had redefined the limits of mobility. It was small, crude, and unarmored, but it had done what entire armored divisions could not. It conquered the desert itself. Germany had learned a bitter truth beneath the Libyan sun. In war, the simplest machine that works everywhere is worth more than the most perfect one that fails where you need it most. The jeep was not just a vehicle, it was freedom on wheels. And freedom, the Germans discovered too late, was the most powerful weapon of all. By early 1943, the Afrika Korps was a shadow of the proud army that had once threatened the Nile. The British Eighth Army pressed westward, and the Americans, new to the desert, but learning fast, joined the pursuit. German logistics had collapsed under the twin blows of distance and Allied air power. Fuel arrived too late or never at all. Tires shredded, bearings failed, engines coughed their last in clouds of dust. Yet in this wreckage, one vehicle still moved. The jeep. In the shattered columns retreating toward Tunisia, the captured American jeeps were the last machines running. They darted ahead of stalled convoys, carrying messages, wounded, and officers. Where heavy half-tracks bogged down, the jeeps simply bounced and clawed their way forward, light enough to float over sand. Soldiers began to call them desert fleas, small, tireless, and impossible to kill. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Rosener had by then given up on his German command car entirely. His unit possessed 4 jeeps, all scavenged from battlefields. One had a cracked windshield held together by wire. Another had its front bumper replaced with a wooden beam. They were patched together from wreckage, one axle Ford, another Willys, steering column from a Kübelwagen. Yet they ran. The mechanics joked that even if you buried a jeep overnight, it would dig itself out by morning. The Kübelwagen, once a symbol of German engineering efficiency, was now a liability. Its air-cooled Volkswagen engine suffered in the brutal heat. Sand clogged the fan housing and burned out the bearings. Its low ground clearance left it stranded on dunes where the jeep danced effortlessly. Reports from field workshops made grim reading. Out of every 10 Kübelwagens that entered service in North Africa, only 6 remained operational after 3 months. For jeeps, even the captured ones, the figure was 8. The Germans tried to adapt. Field modifications appeared everywhere. Mechanics widened Kübelwagen tires, added improvised air filters, even experimented with mounting spare jeep axles. Nothing worked as well as the real thing. The jeep was not merely a design, it was a system, born of mass production and brutal practicality. Its parts were cheap, its construction forgiving. You could hammer a fender straight with a rock, replace a bolt with any scrap of steel, and it would still run. As the Afrika Korps retreated through the passes of Tunisia, Jeeps became more than transport, they became lifelines. Reconnaissance units relied on them to scout for water and fuel. Medical teams used them to evacuate wounded soldiers too far from field hospitals. Intelligence officers used them for night raids, engines muffled, headlights blacked out. Some were armed with MG-34 machine guns, others with Italian Breda light cannons, turning them into makeshift gun trucks. One night, in February 1943, near Kasserine Pass, Rosner's platoon found itself surrounded by advancing American troops. Outnumbered and outgunned, they abandoned their damaged Panzergrenadier trucks and escaped using 3 jeeps. Driving through wadis under moonlight, they crossed 30 kilometers of desert in silence, guided only by the faint gleam of the Milky Way. No German car could have done it, Rosner later wrote. The jeep saved our lives. Word of the vehicle's resilience spread even to Berlin. Reports from North Africa described the American light car as an ideal desert vehicle and recommended its study for future German development. But there was no time. By March, the Afrika Korps was collapsing. What fuel remained was rationed to tanks and staff cars. The jeeps, running on fumes, continued to ferry supplies until the end. When the final surrender came in May 1943, hundreds of jeeps were captured again, this time back by their original owners. For the Americans, finding their old machines in German hands was a strange sight. Some were still painted with white crosses, others carried Luftwaffe registration numbers. One jeep captured near Enfidaville had been converted into a command vehicle for a German panzer general, complete with map table and field telephone mounted in the back. Another had an MG-34 welded over the hood, a grotesque hybrid of practicality and desperation. An American officer inspecting the wrecks after the surrender noted in his report, "Enemy has shown great ingenuity in maintaining captured American vehicles. Many run with parts scavenged from multiple wrecks, indicates superior adaptability of the basic design." The jeep had done more than carry soldiers, it had carried ideas. It taught even its enemies that mobility, not armor, ruled the modern battlefield. A vehicle that any man could fix was worth more than a masterpiece that only a factory could maintain. Germany, with its obsession for mechanical perfection, had been outmaneuvered by simplicity. Rommel, recovering from illness in Germany, received reports from his former staff officers describing how jeeps had dominated the retreat. In a private conversation later recorded by his aide, Rommel remarked, "We built soldiers to fight deserts. The Americans built machines to conquer them." By the time the last Afrika Korps prisoners were shipped to camps in Egypt and Algeria, the jeep had become a legend among them. Many captured German soldiers requested to keep working on jeeps in captivity, preferring them over other vehicles. They trusted them, they admired them. Some even loved them. And yet the bitter truth hung in the air like dust over the Sahara. Every mile a German jeep drove was a confession of defeat. Each gallon of fuel poured into its tank was an admission that the Reich's genius had failed against the humble, mass-produced power of democracy. The desert, once the proving ground of German pride, had taught them to crawl, and the little jeep, mocked, stolen, repainted, and relied upon, was the teacher. By the summer of 1943, the jeep had crossed from curiosity to legend. In the prisoner camps scattered across Algeria and Egypt, captured Afrika Korps soldiers spoke about it in the same breath as tanks and aircraft. "The Americans," they would say, shaking their heads, "make a car like they make bullets, small, cheap, and endless." For the German High Command, the lesson of North Africa arrived too late. Technical reports from the theatre poured into Berlin in the months following the surrender. Engineers at the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Ordnance Office, studied photographs, parts, and performance data of the captured American quarter-ton 4x4 truck. They were astonished. The report, dated August of 1943, described it in bureaucratic prose that barely masked admiration. The American light vehicle combines simplicity with remarkable endurance. Its design allows replacement of parts by untrained personnel. The construction is crude but strong. The overall concept represents a fundamental difference in industrial philosophy. That last phrase, fundamental difference in industrial philosophy, was the quiet confession of Germany's defeat long before Berlin fell. In Stuttgart, engineers at Daimler-Benz and Volkswagen were ordered to study the Jeep's chassis and driveline. They concluded that Germany could produce something similar only by sacrificing craftsmanship, something the Nazi industrial system could not abide. German production lines were built for precision, not volume. Every factory guarded its own designs, every engineer demanded perfection. The Jeep, by contrast, was the triumph of standardization. One bolt size fit everywhere. Every component could be swapped between vehicles, no matter which company had made it. A memo from a Volkswagen engineer captured the truth bluntly. The Americans have conquered the art of imperfection. They build machines that survive misuse. In the ruins of the Reich's obsession with precision, this idea was revolutionary. While Germany built masterpieces that demanded loyalty from their mechanics, America built servants that demanded nothing. That, more than any weapon, was why the Allies would win. The Jeep's reputation spread across the Eastern Front as well. Soviet troops, supplied through Lend-Lease, received thousands of Willys MBs. German soldiers facing them in Ukraine and Belarus were stunned to see Red Army scouts driving the same vehicles they had once captured in Africa. Reports from Army Group Center in late 1943 noted with frustration. Enemy reconnaissance units employ the American four-wheel drive vehicle extensively. It traverses terrain impassable to our light cars. Attempts to follow with Kübelwagen result in repeated immobilization. The phrase repeated immobilization became a dark joke among the troops. In mud, snow, or sand, the Kübelwagen failed where the Jeep thrived. By 1944, the German army had resorted to desperate imitation. A few prototypes of a so-called Einheitsgeländewagen, a standardized all-terrain vehicle, were tested. But with Allied bombing, crippling industry, and raw materials scarce, it never entered mass production. Germany could not afford the steel, the fuel, or the time. The war economy had reached its breaking point. Meanwhile, Jeeps poured from American ports by the tens of thousands. Photographs from British docks showed them stacked in neat rows like crates of ammunition, each stamped with white stars. To German intelligence, such images were demoralizing beyond measure. One Abwehr officer reportedly remarked, "They build in one day what we lose in one battle." Rommel, now far from Africa, still remembered the little machine. In a conversation recorded by his aide Captain Helmuth Lang during the autumn of 1943, he spoke with weary respect. "When I saw their small cars cross sand like boats on water, I knew we were finished," he said. "They drove what we could not build and what we could not imagine." The Jeep's triumph was not mechanical alone. It revealed something far deeper about how the two sides viewed war. Germany saw war as an exhibition of engineering mastery. America saw it as a logistical challenge to be solved by production and practicality. The Jeep was the perfect embodiment of that philosophy, a problem solved by common sense. In every theater, it adapted. In Sicily, it climbed volcanic roads where tanks could not. In Italy, it hauled wounded men from ravines under shell fire. In the Pacific, it drove through coral sand and jungle trails. Soldiers stripped them, modified them, loaded them beyond regulation. And still they ran. There was no ceremony, no reverence, just movement, endless movement. For the German soldier watching from the other side, the Jeep became a symbol of something terrifying, the enemy's inexhaustible capacity. To capture one was to glimpse a civilization that built strength through abundance. It was not a single car that defeated Germany, but what the Jeep represented a world that could build 1,000 more tomorrow. When the Allied invasion of France began in June of 1944, German soldiers saw the familiar silhouettes again. Jeeps roared off landing craft, through surf and mud, towing guns, hauling ammunition, guiding tanks. They were everywhere, multiplying faster than the eye could count. "We destroyed one," wrote an officer of the 21st Panzer Division, and 10 more appeared behind it. It was the same lesson the desert had already taught. In the arithmetic of industrial warfare, one perfect machine meant nothing against an army of imperfection that never stopped moving. By 1945, as the Reich crumbled, even the most die-hard officers had stopped mocking the Jeep. Many used captured ones during the final retreat across Germany. When Berlin fell, Allied troops drove Jeeps through the ruins while German soldiers trudged beside them. The irony was total. The toy car had become the chariot of victory. The very thing Germany had once laughed at had carried its conquerors to the gates of Berlin. They had mocked it, then they had stolen it. And in the end, they had learned to fear it. By the winter of 1944, as the Allied armies rolled across France and into the Low Countries, the Jeep was everywhere. It was in the mud outside Bastogne, crawling past wrecked Shermans. It was in the fog of the Ardennes, bringing messages through artillery fire. It was on the frozen roads of the Hürtgen forest, ferrying medics and ammunition. German soldiers could no longer think of the Jeep as foreign. They saw it every day, driven by their enemies, captured by their own troops, and sometimes abandoned by both when the front shifted too fast to follow. The German army, in its last desperate months, had become a reluctant student of its enemy's machine. Captured Jeeps were pressed into every imaginable role. Photographs from late 1944 show Jeeps with Balkenkreuz insignia rolling through the streets of Arnhem and Aachen, their American stars hastily painted over. Some carried German radio sets, others towed anti-tank guns. In the chaos of retreat, soldiers trusted the Jeep more than they trusted their own supply trucks. At a captured vehicle depot outside Cologne, Oberst Karl Putzke of the 21st Panzer Division recorded his astonishment. The American car is absurdly simple. It has no beauty, no refinement, but it endures. It is not a machine, it is an idea. He watched as mechanics stripped one down in less than an hour, replacing a cracked axle, with parts taken from another wreck. When they restarted the engine, the little four-cylinder coughed, sputtered, then settled into its familiar steady hum. No German car, he wrote, would forgive such treatment. That hum became the background noise of defeat. Allied Jeep engines filled the air across occupied Europe. In every captured town, they were the first vehicles the locals heard the sound of liberation. Children climbed onto their fenders, soldiers handed out chocolate from their seats, priests blessed them in village squares. To the Germans who watched, the humiliation was profound. The machine they had mocked as Kinderspielzeug, a child's toy, had become the symbol of the enemy's unstoppable advance. And yet, even in defeat, the Germans could not help admiring it. At the automotive testing grounds in Kummersdorf, south of Berlin, engineers from the Heereswaffenamt examined several captured Jeeps delivered from France. They dissected them as if performing an autopsy on their own failure. The final report, dated January 1945, read like a eulogy for German engineering. The American light car demonstrates the principle of sufficiency. Each part is only as strong as necessary. No material is wasted. Manufacturing tolerances are coarse, yet the result is functional reliability. It can be built quickly, repaired anywhere, and driven by anyone. It represents the triumph of industrial democracy over craftsmanship. The report circulated quietly among senior officers. Few dared to say it aloud, but everyone knew what it meant. The Reich's industrial arrogance had built its own coffin. The obsession with precision, the worship of perfection, had produced weapons too delicate for total war. The Jeep, born from compromise, simplicity, and mass production, was the opposite of everything the Reich believed in, and that was precisely why it had won. On the front lines, German soldiers did not need reports to understand that truth. They lived it. In the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, German units captured hundreds of Allied vehicles during the first days of the surprise attack. The Jeep was the most coveted prize. Panzer Grenadier units stripped them from abandoned supply columns and used them for reconnaissance and deception. Some were repainted in German camouflage, others left untouched to blend into Allied convoys. American veterans would later recall being fired upon by Jeeps they thought were friendly, but the imitation could not last. the offensive burned itself out in weeks, leaving behind wreckage and frozen bodies. Many of the captured jeeps ran until their last drop of fuel, then sat silent in the snow, testament to a war machine that had forgotten how to move forward on its own. After the Ardennes, even the Luftwaffe used them. At airfields in Germany, mechanics drove jeeps to tow fighter planes into position, replacing the overloaded Kettenkrads and fragile staff cars. One photograph taken at the Recon test base in March 1945 shows a jeep hauling a Messerschmitt Me-2 62 jet fighter across a snowy runway, a snapshot of irony so perfect it could have been staged by history itself. By April, the jeep was as common among retreating Germans as their own trucks. In the final defense of Berlin, a handful of them served as staff cars for officers who could no longer find working German vehicles. One of these was used by General Helmuth Weidling, the city's last defender. When Soviet troops captured his command post, the jeep was still parked outside, its tires flat, its windshield shattered. The Soviets, who had received thousands of jeeps through Lend-Lease, immediately recognized it. They refueled it, cranked the engine, and drove away. Even in the ruins of the Reich, the little machine would not die. When the war finally ended, the jeep became an object of fascination in the occupied zones. German civilians, deprived of transportation, scavenged abandoned ones from roadsides and fields. In the years that followed, jeeps carried farmers to markets, doctors to villages, and children to school. What had once symbolized the enemy became the foundation of post-war mobility. German engineers, rebuilding their shattered industry, studied it once again, this time not as an enemy artifact but as a model. The lessons were clear: simplicity, interchangeability, reliability. These ideas would shape the post-war generation of vehicles, from Volkswagen's revived Beetle to the first civilian all-terrain trucks. At a technical conference in Munich in 1951, a former Wehrmacht engineer, now working for Mercedes-Benz, summed it up best. "We did not lose to better weapons. We lost to better engineering philosophy. The Americans built for the world that was coming. We built for the world that was ending." The Jeep, once derided as a milk cart, had become the blueprint for a new era. It had taught both sides that mobility was not about elegance, but endurance, not about perfection, but persistence. And in that, it had achieved something no other machine of the war could claim: it had changed how the world thought about movement itself. From the deserts of Libya to the rubble of Berlin, the Jeep had travelled every road of the 20th century. It began as a joke, it ended as a symbol. The Reich had mocked it, studied it, stolen it, and finally learned from it. In the end, the Jeep was more than a vehicle. It was a lesson written in steel and dust, one the Germans would never forget. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were dust, rail lines twisted, bridges shattered. Yet through this wreckage, one small machine continued to move the American Jeep. It rattled across cratered roads, splashed through flooded streets, and climbed the rubble of cities that had ceased to exist. Where tanks lay burned and trucks rusted, the Jeep still ran. It had outlasted empires. In the first months of occupation, Allied armies depended on it completely. From the beaches of Normandy to the snowbound ruins of Berlin, it became the new face of authority. Jeeps carried generals, interpreters, mail, medical supplies, and hope. In photographs from that spring, you can see them everywhere: Jeeps draped with victory flags, Jeeps marked with MP on the hood, Jeeps towing carts filled with refugees. They were the workhorses of peace as they had been the tools of war. For the defeated Germans, the sight was bitterly familiar. They had mocked the Jeep once, then stolen it, then fought it, and now they worked on it. In the Allied occupation zones, German mechanics were hired to service and repair the thousands of Jeeps that filled the countryside. Old workshops that had once built vehicles for the Wehrmacht were now filled with American machines. A few German engineers, freed from wartime secrecy, finally examined them in full. The verdict was unanimous. The Jeep was indestructible not because it was perfect, but because it was simple. "Every bolt is honest," one engineer remarked. "It does exactly what it was made to do." In a country where the war had destroyed everything, including faith in engineering ideals, the Jeep became a symbol of a new kind of practicality. It had no ideology, no ornament, no grandeur. It just worked. In those first chaotic years after the war, the Jeep's presence became so common that it blurred the lines between conqueror and conquered. German farmers hitched them to ploughs. Doctors used them to reach remote villages where no roads remained. Postal workers carried mail across mountains in vehicles once painted with invasion stripes. For many Germans, their first post-war job was fixing or driving Jeeps. And yet, even amid that daily utility, the machine carried the echo of the war it had won. Every dent and bullet hole told a story. The desert of Libya, the fair hedgerows of Normandy, the mud of the Ardennes. The Jeep had survived everything: sandstorms, snowstorms, shellfire, and sabotage. Mechanics joked that if civilization collapsed, the last sound on Earth would be a Jeep starting. By 1947, thousands of Jeeps remained in service across Europe. Some were officially transferred to civilian use under the Marshall Plan, their olive drab paint replaced by the logos of reconstruction agencies. Others simply stayed where they had been, left on farms, in barns, in forgotten courtyards, and were put to work again by anyone who could make them run. Spare parts were improvised from scrap or traded through black markets that stretched from Bremen to Trieste. The Jeep, built to be temporary, had become eternal. The German automotive industry, struggling to rebuild under Allied supervision, took careful note. Engineers who had once designed tanks now studied the Jeep's suspension and drivetrain. Ferdinand Porsche himself, under post-war investigation but still an engineer at heart, reportedly remarked to colleagues that the Americans have built the modern people's car, only they built it for war. He was not wrong. The DNA of the Jeep, its simplicity, its ruggedness, its universality, would find echoes in every vehicle that followed, from the Volkswagen Type II transporter to the Land Rover. Former Wehrmacht officers, writing their memoirs in the late 1940s, could not resist mentioning it either. General Siegfried Westphal, Rommel's chief of staff, described the Jeep as the most democratic machine ever built. He meant it literally. It had no hierarchy. Generals sat on the same canvas seats as privates. It could carry a colonel or a farmer, a doctor or a mechanic, and make no distinction. To a nation obsessed with rank and order, this was quietly revolutionary. When the Cold War began, the Jeep found new battles to fight. American occupation forces remained in Germany, their convoys still filled with the same faithful vehicles that had carried them through war. Soviet officers in the Eastern Zone inspected captured ones, reverse-engineered them, and produced their own version, the GAZ-69, built directly from Jeep blueprints provided through Lend-Lease. Thus, the machine that had symbolized American ingenuity became a global template, reproduced in factories from Moscow to Tokyo. Yet in Germany itself, the Jeep took on a different meaning. To civilians, it became the first visible proof that the world could move again. After years of rationing, rubble, and starvation, the sight of a Jeep bouncing down a street meant that the mail would come, the doctor would arrive, or the roads would be cleared. It became part of daily life, a constant presence in a country rediscovering motion. There are stories, perhaps apocryphal, but telling of children in ruined towns chasing after Jeeps shouting, "Chocolate, chocolate," as soldiers tossed candy from the back. Those children, grown decades later, would remember not the tanks or planes, but the sound of the Jeep's engine echoing between the bombed-out walls. In 1952, when the new West German army, the Bundeswehr, was formed, its officers faced a question: what vehicle should serve as its light transport? The answer was unanimous. They chose a design based directly on the Jeep, produced under license by Ford and Auto Union. It was the final irony. The army that had once mocked the American toy car now built its own descendants. The Jeep, meanwhile, continued its quiet service worldwide. In Korea, Indochina, and the Balkans, in jungles and mountains, deserts and frozen plains, it carried soldiers, supplies, and survivors. The world changed around it. Jets replaced propeller planes, Missiles replaced bombs, but the Jeep remained unchanged, unpretentious, eternal. In 1962, at an international symposium on wartime engineering held in Stuttgart, a former German automotive engineer named Hans Rosner, the same officer who had first called the Jeep a milk cart, in the Libyan desert 2 decades earlier, spoke to an audience of students. His hair was white now, his voice slow, but his words carried weight. "We thought the Jeep was ugly," he said. "We thought it was crude. We thought it had no honor. But when everything else broke, it was still there. That machine taught us humility. It taught us what works matters more than what impresses." The auditorium fell silent. Rosner smiled faintly. "When I see one today," he added, "I do not see an American vehicle. I see the machine that saved us from ourselves." Outside, in the museum courtyard, a restored Willys MB sat gleaming beneath the sun, its olive paint faded, its tires dusty, its metal scarred with history. On its windshield, someone had written in chalk, "Still running," and it was, because the Jeep had never really stopped. By the early 1950s, the war was already history, but the Jeep refused to become a relic. It rolled from battlefields into farms, from front lines into factories, from army depots into the hands of civilians who could barely afford shoes. In every corner of the world recovering from the chaos, there was a Jeep patched, repainted, rebuilt, still doing what it had been born to do: move. In Germany, its legend only deepened. Along the autobahns rebuilt under Allied supervision, Jeeps were among the first vehicles to return to service. Civil engineers used them to survey roads. Postal workers used them to deliver mail through the ruins. They were seen in Berlin, in Frankfurt, in Cologne, small, humble, unstoppable. Their olive-drab bodies carried new coats of civilian grey and forest green. What had once been the chariot of the invader had become the engine of reconstruction. The irony was not lost on those who remembered. Old Wehrmacht mechanics, now working under Allied contracts, would shake their heads when a Jeep came in for repair. "Still the same bolts, still the same sound," they would mutter. The parts were crude but clever, the axles simple but strong. Each piece could be removed, repaired, or replaced by hand. In a time when factories still struggled to produce precision tools, this simplicity was salvation. The American military, aware of the Jeep's post-war success, began exporting it deliberately not as a weapon, but as a gift. Through the Marshall Plan, Jeeps were delivered to every European nation rebuilding from the ruins. In Italy, they climbed mountain roads to reach isolated villages. In France, they carried engineers who rebuilt bridges. In the Netherlands, they became the workhorses of farmers draining flooded fields. The same machine that had once brought war now delivered life. For the Germans, the transformation was more than mechanical, it was psychological. The Jeep embodied a kind of freedom they had never known. Freedom from dependence on perfect machines, from the tyranny of fragility. It was proof that a society could build strength through accessibility, not exclusivity. The Jeep's genius lay not in its precision, but in its forgiveness. It tolerated mistakes. It could be misused, abused, neglected, and it would still start in the morning. By 1953, a generation of German engineers had begun to absorb this lesson. The rebirth of Volkswagen, for example, drew directly from it. The Beetle was small, cheap, and easy to fix, a civilian echo of the same industrial logic that had built the Jeep. Likewise, Mercedes-Benz engineers began designing the G-Class concept that would later dominate off-road design. Every bolt of the new German post-war industry carried a trace of that little 4x4 that had once bounced across the sands of Libya. Even in the Eastern Bloc, where propaganda painted American machines as symbols of capitalist decadence, the Jeep's influence was impossible to ignore. The Soviet Gazoo and Polish UAZ were almost perfect copies, right down to the placement of the spare tire and the folding windshield. When German engineers visited Moscow in 1955 as part of a technical exchange, they recognized the lineage immediately. "It's still the same Jeep," one remarked quietly, "just wearing a different uniform." In popular culture, too, the Jeep became a myth. In newsreels and films, it was shown carrying victorious generals and smiling soldiers. To the public, it symbolized not just victory, but movement, progress, reconstruction, modernity. For German civilians, it came to represent something more personal: endurance. When nothing else worked, the Jeep did. In the Bavarian Alps, mountain rescue teams used them to reach stranded climbers. In Hamburg, fire brigades used surplus Jeeps as emergency vehicles. Even small-town priests borrowed them to deliver aid to parishes cut off by snow. In a world still half-ruined, the Jeep was the only machine that could always find a way through. The Allied occupation forces eventually began selling off their remaining Jeeps to civilians for symbolic prices, 100 marks, sometimes 50. It was less a sale than a gesture of reconciliation. "If you can fix it," said one American officer in Munich, "it's yours." Thousands did. The German talent for improvisation, so often undone by over-engineering during the war, found its perfect outlet in the Jeep. Families converted them into pickup trucks, taxis, or even makeshift buses. There are photographs from 1954 showing children sitting on the fenders of Jeeps painted with flowers and slogans of peace. In the same year, a group of former Wehrmacht officers, now driving instructors, formed Germany's first off-road training school outside Stuttgart. Their vehicle of choice was, of course, the Jeep. In a small ceremony, one of the founders, Colonel Ernst Vollmer, declared, "This car taught us that roads are illusions. There is always a way forward." As the Cold War deepened, American Jeeps remained in Europe as part of NATO's growing presence. Once again, German soldiers now wearing new uniforms under a new flag trained with them. In a strange symmetry, the same machine that had once carried their conquerors now carried them as allies. The Bundeswehr's early motor pools were filled with Jeeps marked not with the black cross of the Reich, but the iron cross of democracy. Yet beyond military symbolism, the Jeep had become a teacher. It taught post-war engineers that complexity was weakness disguised as brilliance. It taught mechanics that a machine's worth lay not in precision, but in resilience. And it taught societies that true strength came not from hierarchy, but from universality from machines that any man, anywhere, could use. In 1958, during a NATO logistics conference in Bonn, a German general stood before an audience of American and British officers. On the table beside him was a small model of a Jeep, painted olive green and scarred with rust. He held it up and said simply, "This was our first lesson in freedom. It does not break, it does not stop, and it does not care who drives it. That is why it won." The room fell silent, and for a moment, even the veterans who had once faced each other in battle understood. The Jeep had become more than a machine. It was the proof that simplicity, persistence, and faith in ordinary men could triumph over the arrogance of perfection. By the time the 1960s dawned, the world had moved on to faster, sleeker, more powerful machines. But in every garage, on every farm, and behind every factory, a few Jeeps still waited, scarred, faithful, eternal. Engines that had crossed deserts and mountains still turned over at the pull of a choke. They no longer belonged to armies or nations. They belonged to history itself. And as one old German mechanic told a journalist in 1961, patting the hood of a Jeep he had been maintaining for 15 years, "It came from America, but it works like the truth, simple, unstoppable, and for everyone."